In August 25, 1944. Cherbourg Harbor, Normandy, France. The wrench slipped from Sergeant William Henderson's grease-stained hands as he stared at the endless convoy forming before him. The British said these trucks would fail. They said the design was flawed, underpowered, worthless for modern warfare. Now Henderson watched as 6,000 of them prepared to attempt the impossible, to supply General Patton's racing Third Army across 400 miles of devastated French countryside. The letters GMC stamped on the hood stood for General Motors Corporation. But to the 75% African-American drivers climbing into those cabs, exhausted before their journey even began, those letters meant something else entirely. They meant survival. They meant the difference between victory and defeat. They meant the lifeline that would keep Allied armies pushing toward Germany. What none of them knew that August morning was that this truck, deemed inadequate by British military experts just 4 years earlier, would prove more valuable than tanks, more crucial than fighters, more essential than any weapon system in the European theater. The humble 2.5-ton GMC CCKW, the Jimmy, the deuce and a half, was about to write itself into history as the backbone of the most desperate supply operation the world had ever seen. The story begins not in the chaos of war, but in the quiet design rooms of General Motors in 1939. The United States Army Ordnance Corps had issued specifications for a new medium tactical truck. They needed a 2.5-ton load-rated vehicle with 6-wheel drive capability, able to operate off-road in any weather condition. The requirement seemed straightforward. The solution would prove anything but. General Motors Truck and Coach Division, operating from their Pontiac, Michigan facility, approached the problem with modified commercial truck components. They took their existing AC Series truck design and made critical modifications: a second rear axle for improved traction, all-wheel drive for off-road capability, and strengthened frame rails. The result was designated ACKWX353, the predecessor to what would become the CCKW. The initial design utilized a GMC 248-inch inline 6-cylinder engine producing just 77 horsepower. By commercial standards, they were adequate. By military standards, they were questionable. France placed an order of 1,000 of these experimental 6x6 trucks in late 1939. They were in essence commercial trucks in military clothing. Then came the catastrophe that changed everything. German panzer divisions smashed through the Ardennes in May 1940, bypassing the Maginot Line. The French army collapsed. France fell in 6 weeks. 2,000 of the ACKW trucks had already been delivered to France. They were captured by German forces and would ironically serve the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, where German soldiers grudgingly admitted their reliability. The remaining order, along with additional units, was diverted to Great Britain under emergency wartime contracts. The British Army took delivery of the ACKW trucks in summer 1940 and immediately subjected them to rigorous testing. British military evaluators were not impressed. Their reports, preserved in military archives, were damning. The wheelbase was too long for European roads. The trucks were difficult to maneuver. The 77-horsepower engine was underpowered for the vehicle's weight, especially when fully loaded. Acceleration was poor. Hill climbing ability was marginal. British Army officials concluded the ACKW was unsuitable for modern mechanized warfare. They deemed the design fundamentally flawed. Rather than commit these trucks to combat, the War Office diverted approximately 1,000 units to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease agreements. The British rejection appeared to validate concerns that American truck manufacturers could not produce vehicles suitable for European warfare. General Motors engineers, stung by this assessment, went back to their drawing boards. The lessons were clear. More power was needed. The chassis required refinement. But the fundamental concept, a 6x6 median tactical truck built from commercial components for rapid mass production, remained sound. American engineers understood something their British colleagues had overlooked. This was not about building the perfect truck. This was about building adequate trucks in numbers that would overwhelm any enemy through sheer industrial capacity. In 1941, General Motors introduced the redesigned version, designated CCKW. The improvements were substantial. The new GMC 270 cubic inch inline six-cylinder engine replaced the 248, producing 104 horsepower. A 27 horsepower increase might not sound dramatic, but it transformed the truck's performance, providing the low-end torque needed for heavy loads and steep grades. Engineers designed two wheelbase options, the 352 for artillery prime mover duties, and the 353, which became the standard cargo configuration. The frame was a conventional ladder design, simple to manufacture and repair. Brakes were hydraulic with vacuum assist. Initial production models retained the closed metal cab, but as war production accelerated and steel became a rationed strategic material, GMC engineers made a critical decision. Beginning in July 1943, new CCKW trucks received open cabs with canvas tops and removable doors. This change saved approximately 150 pounds of steel per vehicle. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of trucks, and the steel savings became enough to build dozens of destroyers or hundreds of tanks. What emerged was a truck that prioritized simplicity, reliability, and ease of mass production over performance. The CCKW would never win races, but it could be built in enormous numbers by semi-skilled workers and repaired in field conditions by mechanics with basic tools. General Motors placed the primary production contract with their yellow truck and coach facility in Pontiac, Michigan. As orders multiplied, Chevrolet's St. Louis, Missouri plant joined production. At peak output, these two facilities were completing one CCKW truck every 7 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The assembly lines never stopped. Production numbers tell the story of American industrial mobilization. From 1941 through 1945, General Motors manufactured approximately 562,750 CCKW trucks across all variants. To put this in perspective, Germany produced approximately 100,000 total trucks of all types during the same period. The Soviet Union manufactured fewer than 200,000. Great Britain's entire wartime truck production was dwarfed by this single American model. The CCKW alone nearly equaled the combined truck production of all Axis powers. The CCKW spawned dozens of specialized variants, dump trucks, tankers, mobile workshops, communications vans, ambulances, record trucks, and anti-aircraft platforms. Each variant used the same basic chassis, engine, and drivetrain, simplifying maintenance and spare parts logistics. But numbers mean nothing without application. And in June 1944, the CCKW faced its greatest test. The test would come not from German anti-tank guns. It would come from simple physics, from the tyranny of distance, and the mathematics of supply.
June 6, 1944. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on 5 Normandy beaches. By mid-July, more than 1 million Allied troops were crammed into a pocket approximately 50 miles wide. They were going nowhere. The Germans had turned Normandy into a defensive nightmare. Ancient hedgerows, thick walls of earth and vegetation divided the landscape. Each hedgerow was a ready-made defensive position. American infantry and armor bled through this bulkage country at horrific cost. Then came Operation Cobra. On July 25, 1944, American forces launched a massive breakout. Within days, German defensive lines cracked. American armored divisions poured through the breach. By early August, General George Patton's Third Army was racing across open French countryside, covering 50, 60, sometimes 80 miles per day. But Patton's tankers soon faced an enemy more dangerous than any panzer division. They were running out of fuel. Each Sherman tank consumed approximately 150 gallons of gasoline per 100 miles. An armored division burned through massive quantities. Patton's fuel requirements alone exceeded 400,000 gallons daily. Total Allied fuel consumption in early August 1944 exceeded 3 million gallons per day. Nobody had anticipated a breakthrough this dramatic. Within a month, lead elements approached 350 miles from their supply bases. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, every can of rations had to travel that distance over war-damaged roads. The destruction of French railroads had been deliberate. To prevent German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches, Allied air forces had spent months systematically bombing every railroad yard and bridge. The campaign succeeded brilliantly. But those same bombed railroads could not now supply Allied armies. The Mulberry harbors, those incredible artificial ports, had sustained the invasion force, but a massive storm in mid-June had destroyed the American Mulberry. Cherbourg had been captured, but its port facilities were so thoroughly demolished by German engineers that restoration would take months. In late August 1944, American commanders faced catastrophe. Patton's tanks were running dry. First Army was rationing ammunition. Without immediate massive resupply, the Allied advance would stall. German forces would gain time to consolidate. The opportunity to end the war in 1944 would be lost. On August 21, 1944, American logistics officers held an emergency planning conference. 36 hours of non-stop meetings produced a solution so desperate, so audacious, that it could only have been conceived by Americans. They would create a dedicated express convoy system. Every available truck would be pressed into continuous service. 2 one-way routes would be established from Normandy to forward supply points. All civilian traffic would be banned. Military police would control every intersection to ensure convoys never stopped. The plan required more trucks than any single command possessed. Logistics officers began stripping trucks from every non-critical unit. Artillery battalions gave up their prime movers. Engineer units surrendered haulers. Medical companies released ambulances. Every truck capable of rolling became part of the operation. The primary vehicle was the GMC CCKW. 6,000 vehicles were assembled. But trucks need drivers, and here American racism created both crisis and opportunity. The United States Army in 1944 remained strictly segregated. African American soldiers served in separate units under predominantly white officers. Military policy, based on racist assumptions, held that black soldiers lacked the intelligence and courage for combat roles. Therefore, African Americans were assigned primarily to service units, quartermaster companies, port battalions, transportation units, truck drivers. In August 1944, the European theater contained approximately 210,000 African American soldiers. Nearly half served in the Quartermaster Corps. When the call went out for truck drivers, these men answered, not because they wanted to drive trucks for 60 hours straight, not because they enjoyed being segregated and discriminated against. They answered because their country needed them, because combat troops depended on them, and because African American soldiers understood that serving with distinction advanced the cause of civil rights at home. 17,000 African American soldiers became Red Ball Express drivers. 3,000 additional white soldiers joined them, though in practice the operation remained largely segregated. Many drivers had never driven a truck before military service. They received hasty training, sometimes just days, before being declared qualified to drive 2.5-ton military trucks loaded with 5 tons of cargo through combat zones. The African-American soldiers who became Red Ball Express drivers came from every corner of the United States: farm boys from Mississippi, factory workers from Detroit, college students, sharecroppers' sons, men who had faced discrimination their entire lives, now found themselves entrusted with the most critical supply mission of the war. The Red Ball Express began operation on August 25, 1944. The name came from railroad terminology. Railroad companies marked priority express freight cars with red balls, signaling all other traffic to yield. Now, red balls appeared on signs marking dedicated truck routes across France. The system was brilliantly simple. 2 parallel one-way routes connected Normandy to forward supply points. The northern route carried loaded trucks toward the front. The southern route returned empty trucks, often carrying German prisoners as backhaul cargo. Total route length eventually stretched nearly 400 miles. Convoys were ordered to maintain 60 yards intervals and 25 miles per hour maximum speed. In reality, speed limits became suggestions. Drivers removed or disabled engine governors, pushing the CCKW trucks well past their designed 56 miles per hour maximum speed. Some veterans reported speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour, a terrifying velocity in a 2.5-ton truck with 1940s suspension and brakes. The S-793 Military Police Battalion provided traffic control. MPs manned every major intersection, ensuring Red Ball convoys never stopped. Each round trip took approximately 54 hours. 2-man driver teams shared duties, though in practice both men often stayed awake for entire runs. The trucks carried everything forward: gasoline, ammunition, food rations, medical supplies, spare parts, and mail from home. Loading operations at Cherbourg ran 24 hours daily. A CCKW could be loaded with 5 tons of cargo in under 10 minutes. Drivers signed for their loads and rolled toward the front. No rest stops, no delays. Keep them rolling. The journey itself was an ordeal. Drivers operated in blackout conditions at night using tiny cat-eye blackout lights that provided almost no illumination. They navigated by memory, by following the truck ahead, by sheer instinct. Roads were cratered, bridges were damaged. German air attacks, though increasingly rare, remained a threat. Drivers learned to watch the sky, to scatter off roads when air raid warnings sounded. Some trucks mounted .50 caliber machine guns on ring mounts for defense. Landmines posed a constant danger. German forces planted mines in road shoulders. Red Ball drivers learned to stay on pavement, to watch for disturbed earth. Fatigue was the greatest enemy. Men pushed themselves past human limits, sustained by coffee and determination. Some drivers took benzodrine tablets, amphetamines issued by medical officers to combat exhaustion. The drugs kept men awake, but impaired judgment, leading to accidents. Many drivers fell asleep at the wheel. Vehicles ran off roads in darkness. The trucks themselves suffered terribly. The CCKW was designed for military use, but continuous operation without proper maintenance exceeded any design specification. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, clutches burned out, brakes wore through, tires failed with alarming frequency.
Maintenance was performed under impossible conditions. Mechanics worked beside roads, in fields, under tarps. They had basic tools and whatever spare parts to be scrounged. Many repairs were field expedient, good enough to get the truck moving again. Oil changes were skipped. Scheduled maintenance was ignored. Everything was sacrificed to keep trucks rolling. Mechanics became masters of improvisation. They fashioned gaskets from scavenged materials. They bypassed broken components. They cannibalized parts from one truck to repair another. The CCKW's simple design made this possible. This adaptability, born of desperate necessity, proved one of the truck's greatest strengths. By late August, broken trucks littered the Red Ball routes. Some estimates suggest over 80 vehicles were simply abandoned. At one point, nearly 30% of Red Ball trucks had significant mechanical problems, but they kept rolling anyway. Yet the operation succeeded beyond all projections. Within 5 days of starting, the Red Ball Express hit peak capacity. On August 29, 1944, 132 truck companies operating 5,958 vehicles delivered 12,342 tons of supplies to forward depots. This single-day performance exceeded every pre-war estimate. Daily deliveries averaged between 10,000 and 12,500 tons. 900 trucks were on the road at any given moment. Over 82 days of operation, Red Ball Express drivers hauled 412,193 tons of supplies across France. They kept multiple army groups supplied during the most rapid advance in military history. Private James Rookard of the 514th Quartermaster Regiment later recalled the experience. "We hauled anything General Patton needed: gasoline, ammunition, food. We took it all the way to the front lines, back and forth, back and forth. Some drivers ran into ambushes. My company was lucky, but they were shooting all around us. My worst memories were seeing trucks get blown up and being afraid I might get killed. But when General Patton said, 'Be there,' you were there, even if you had to drive all day and all night." Rookard's testimony captured the reality of Red Ball operations: the constant fear, the exhaustion, the pride, the determination. Corporal Washington Rector of the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company described the racial dynamics. "You accepted discrimination. We were warned not to fraternize with whites. Some white drivers would try to prevent black drivers from passing their convoys, creating dangerous road conditions. But most white combat troops appreciated us. They knew we were risking our lives to get them what they needed." Rector's account revealed the complex racial tensions. Black and white units often operated separately. White MPs might stop black drivers more frequently. Yet on the roads, when German shells fell or when a truck broke down, race often mattered less than survival. The trucks themselves became legendary among drivers. The CCKW could take incredible abuse. You could overload them, overspeed them, skip maintenance, and they kept running. Sure, they broke down a lot, but you could fix them with basic tools. That's what mattered. The Jimmy was simple. Simple meant it worked. Drivers developed deep familiarity with their trucks. They learned the sound of every component, recognizing when something was about to fail. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express was delivering supplies to depots 350 miles from Normandy. The logistics became increasingly complex. Theft became a problem as valuable cargo, gasoline, cigarettes, food, disappeared from trucks and found their way onto black markets in liberated French cities. Yet the trucks kept rolling because the alternative was unthinkable. General Patton's Third Army consumed supplies faster than any military formation in history. His aggressive tactics generated results, but only because the Red Ball Express kept his forces fueled and armed. Patton himself recognized the operation's importance. He understood that logistics enabled everything. His tanks were worthless without fuel, his artillery silent without shells. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, recognized the operation's importance. In an October message to Red Ball Express personnel, he wrote, "To you, drivers and mechanics and your officers who keep the Red Ball vehicles constantly moving, I wish to express my deep appreciation. You're doing an excellent job." Eisenhower understood that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome logistical failure. The contrast with German logistics was stark. The Wehrmacht, despite its reputation, relied heavily on horse-drawn transport, employing more than 2.8 million horses during the war. German truck production was limited. German forces in France in 1944 faced a logistical nightmare. Allied air superiority made daylight movement nearly impossible. The Wehrmacht's horse-drawn supply system could not support mobile warfare. By mid-November 1944, the strategic situation had changed. Antwerp's port facilities were finally cleared and open to Allied shipping. The shorter supply line from Antwerp reduced trucking distances dramatically. French railroads, repaired by engineers, began operating. Portable gasoline pipelines started delivering fuel directly to forward depots. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ended operations after 82 days. The drivers, exhausted, returned to their original units. Some transferred to combat roles, as the Army, desperate for infantry replacements, began accepting African American volunteers for frontline service. The final statistics told the story. 412,193 tons delivered, 6,000 trucks at peak operation, 23,000 personnel, 75% African American, operating continuously for 82 days. But the real story was the truck. The GMC CCKW, dismissed by British experts as inadequate, proved itself the most valuable tactical vehicle of World War II. Its simplicity, the very characteristic that made it seem inferior, was its greatest strength. The trucks could be abused, overloaded, and neglected, and yet they continued functioning. The truck's simple, robust design meant that even severely damaged vehicles could often limp to their destination. General Patton stated flatly that the 2.5-ton truck is our most valuable weapon. He understood that without supply, armies become mobs. The humble CCKW truck made modern mechanized warfare possible. Colonel John Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son, wrote after the war that without the Red Ball truck drivers, the advance across France could not have been made. The war might have extended into 1946 without this logistic success. In December 1944, the concept faced its final test. German forces launched the Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last major offensive caught American forces by surprise. The situation required massive, rapid reinforcement. The Red Ball Express was officially over, but the trucks were not, and neither were the drivers. Reformed under different names, convoy operations resumed. The same GMC CCKW now rushed reinforcements to contain the German breakthrough. The same African-American drivers returned to the roads in winter conditions that made August's problems seem trivial. Snow and ice covered the roads. Blackout driving became even more dangerous. Frostbite became a constant danger for drivers in open-cab trucks. Yet the supply convoys continued, proving the logistics system could adapt to any conditions.
After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the CCKW continued serving. Trucks that had crossed France now occupied Germany, hauled displaced persons, and distributed food. Production continued until 1945. By war's end, General Motors had built more CCKW trucks than Germany built vehicles of all types combined. These trucks served not just America, but Allied forces worldwide. The truck's simplicity translated to remarkable longevity. CCKWs remained in active American military service through the 1960s. Many were sold as surplus to foreign militaries, where they served into the 1970s and 80s. The Red Ball Express drivers, particularly the African-American majority, received recognition slowly. The 1952 film, Red Ball Express, while acknowledging African-American participation, was modified at Department of Defense insistence to show a racial integration that did not exist in 1944. Many Red Ball veterans returned to an America still deeply segregated. Men who had risked their lives against fascism faced discrimination in housing, employment, and civil rights. Some used GI Bill benefits, but even these were often harder to access for African Americans. But the story endured. In the 1980s and 90s, historians began a fuller accounting. Veteran testimonies were recorded. James Rookard, who served with the 114th Field Artillery, told reporters years later, "I'm proud I served. We were young. We were scared, but we did what needed doing. A lot of white folks didn't think black soldiers could handle responsibility. We proved them wrong. Every supply run that reached the front line on time, that was us proving we deserved respect. That was us fighting for freedom, foreign and domestic." Rookard's words captured the double consciousness of African-American World War II veterans. They fought for American victory while knowing America denied them full citizenship. They served with distinction, understanding that their performance advanced the broader struggle for civil rights. The Red Ball Express became part of the evidence that would eventually help dismantle segregation in the decades after the war. The technical lessons from Red Ball influenced military logistics for decades. The concept of continuous supply convoys and dedicated routes became standard doctrine. The CCKW 6x6 configuration became standard for military medium tactical trucks. It proved that in total war, adequate vehicles produced in overwhelming numbers defeat superior vehicles produced in limited quantities. Simplicity is its own form of sophistication.
The story of the GMC CCKW and the Red Ball Express is ultimately a story about what wins wars. Not the most advanced technology, not the most impressive specifications. What wins wars is reliable equipment, produced in quantities that overwhelm the enemy, operated by determined people who understand their mission matters. The CCKW was not the best truck of World War II. It was adequate. But adequate trucks, by the hundreds of thousands, driven by drivers willing to work until they collapsed, supplied the most successful military campaign in history. The humble 2.5-ton truck, dismissed as worthless by British experts, became the lifeline that sustained Allied armies from Normandy to the Elbe River. And the drivers, 75% of them African-American soldiers fighting for a country that still denied them basic civil rights, proved that excellence knows no racial boundary. They drove through exhaustion, through fear, through discrimination, because the mission mattered. On August 25, 1944, Sergeant William Henderson finished tightening the last bolt on a CCKW engine and watched the truck roll out to join the convoy. The British said these trucks were worthless. Henderson knew better. He knew that in the next 82 days, these supposedly inadequate vehicles would write themselves into history. Not through dramatic combat action, but through simple, stubborn, unglamorous work. Hauling supplies, keeping armies moving, winning the war. The GMC CCKW, the Jimmy, the Deuce and a Half, the truck the British rejected, the vehicle that became America's secret weapon, the lifeline of the Red Ball Express. Proof that sometimes the most valuable things are the simplest ones, operated by people determined to get the job done no matter the cost. The legacy of the Red Ball Express is not just the story of tonnage moved, it's a lesson in philosophy. The war in Europe was a clash of industrial doctrines. The German doctrine, built on a pursuit of engineering perfection, created magnificent, terrifying weapons, the Tiger tank, the Messerschmitt 26 jet. But these machines were complex, resource-intensive, and difficult to repair. They were thoroughbreds. The American doctrine, embodied by the CCKW, was the opposite. It was a doctrine of mass-produced, good-enough simplicity. The beating heart of the Jimmy was the GMC 270 engine. It was not a high-performance, overhead cam marvel. It was a simple, flathead, inline-six, a stove-bolt engine, a design that was already considered old-fashioned. But its genius lay in its simplicity. Its compression ratio was low. This meant it didn't need high-octane, specialized aviation-grade gasoline like many of the German engines. It could happily, reliably run on the low-quality, 72-octane red gasoline that was being pumped ashore in Normandy. When your entire army runs on gasoline, the ability to drink any gasoline is a war-winning advantage. When a German Panzer's high-performance Maybach engine broke down, it required a specialized mechanic and precision-milled parts. When a GMC 270 engine faltered, a farm boy from Alabama with a wrench and a bit of wire could often get it running again in under an hour. This contrast was the entire war in miniature. Let's look at the other side. The standard German equivalent to the CCKW was the Opel Blitz. It was an excellent truck, reliable and capable, but Germany could not produce enough of them. For every one Opel Blitz that rolled off the assembly line, America was building nearly 10 CCKWs. As a result, the German army's supply chain was a logistical nightmare. It was a chaotic zoo of captured vehicles. On the Eastern Front, Wehrmacht mechanics were struggling to find spare parts for captured French Renault, Czech Pragas, British Bedfords, and even the very ACKWX trucks that the British had rejected and sent to Russia, which were then captured by the Germans. A German motor pool officer might have 20 different truck models, each requiring different spark plugs, different oil filters, different tires. Now consider the American mechanic. He had one truck, the CCKW, and the Jeep. The parts were interchangeable. The tools were standard. The training was universal. This was the true secret weapon. Not just the truck, but the standardization. It was an industrial-scale simplification of war. The CCKW was the physical manifestation of an assembly line that stretched 3,000 miles from Pontiac, Michigan, directly to the front line outside Bastogne.
And what of the men who drove this assembly line? The original transcript touched on their exhaustion, but the reality was a unique circle of hell. The constant deafening roar of the 270 engine, which was right next to the driver in the cab. The bone-jarring rattle of the stiff leaf-spring suspension on cratered roads. The incessant vibration that numbed their hands and feet. They lived on K rations, cold, waxy processed meat, hard biscuits, and a fruit bar. They drank bitter coffee brewed in helmets over open fires, and they smoked. The trucks were filled with a permanent haze of cigarette smoke, the only stimulant that, combined with the amphetamines, could cut through the fog of fatigue. The two-man buddy system was the only thing that kept men alive. One man would drive, his eyes burning, staring into the pinprick blackout light of the truck 60 yards ahead. The other man, the co-driver, was not allowed to sleep. His job was to talk, to shout, to sing, to tell stories, to ask questions, and when the driver's head inevitably slumped, to punch him in the arm, hard, to startle him awake. When that failed, they would switch seats, and the cycle would begin again. For 54 hours. They became intimately familiar with their truck's every sound. They knew the specific ping a cooling engine block made. They knew the groan the transmission made just before a gear shift. And they knew the terrifying sudden pop of an overloaded tire blowing out at 50 miles per hour, a sound that often meant a fatal crash into a ditch or a tree. And then there was the winter. The Red Ball Express officially ended in November, but the trucks and drivers did not stop. They were just reorganized. As the front moved into the Ardennes, the mission continued under new names: the White Ball Express, running from Antwerp, the Green Diamond route, the Red Lion. But it was the same men in the same trucks facing a new, terrifying enemy, the worst European winter in 50 years. The drivers in the new open-cab CCKWs suffered the most. The canvas top and removable doors offered almost no protection from the sub-zero temperatures, the driving snow, and the freezing rain. Frostbite was a constant, crippling danger. Drivers would wrap their feet in burlap sacks. They would line their gloves with newspapers. Their sea rations would freeze solid. To stay warm, they would sometimes unlatch the side of the engine hood and prop it open just an inch, allowing the hot, oily, exhaust-filled air from the engine block to blast into the cab. It was suffocating, but it was better than freezing to death. During the Battle of the Bulge, these same trucks, driven by these same exhausted men, became the firewall. When the 101st Airborne was surrounded in Bastogne, holding out against a massive German siege, their commander, General Macaulay, famously replied, "Nuts," to the German surrender demand. But that bravado was meaningless without ammunition. It was the truck convoys, driving through blizzards, on ice-covered roads, strafed by the Luftwaffe, that carried the ammunition, medical supplies, and food that allowed the 101st to hold on. They weren't just a supply line, they were a lifeline. Combat troops fought the battles, but the truck drivers decided who won them. The war ended and the CCKW service had only just begun. While other more famous weapons like the Sherman tank and the P-51 Mustang were quickly retired or sold off, the Deuce-and-a-half was just too useful to let go. The U.S. military kept them as the primary workhorse through the entire Korean War. In the 1950s, the M35 truck was designed to replace it, but the CCKW was stubborn. Thousands remained in service with National Guard units well into the 1960s. Some were still being used in the early days of the Vietnam War. The Allies, who had received them through Lend-Lease, kept them even longer. The French Army used CCKWs as their main transport truck in their war in Indochina. The Soviet Union, which had received thousands, was deeply impressed. They studied its 6x6 design, its simple engine, and its ruggedness. Post-war Soviet trucks, like the ZIL-157, bear an uncanny resemblance to the CCKW. The Jimmy had not only won the war, it was now defining the utility trucks of its former allies and future enemies. Globally, they were sold as surplus, and a new life began. They became logging trucks in the Pacific Northwest, farm trucks in South America, and construction haulers in Africa. Their simplicity made them perfect for developing nations where paved roads were rare and advanced repair shops non-existent. Even today, in some corners of the world, you can still find a 1943 GMC CCKW, its engine still turning over, hauling cargo. And what of the drivers? The 17,000 African-American men who were the heart of the Red Ball Express? They returned home in 1945 not to ticker-tape parades, but to the same segregated lunch counters and whites-only signs they had left. They had been trusted to move the entire U.S. Army, but in many states they were still not trusted to vote. But something had changed. These men had proven their worth, not just to the white officers who depended on them, but to themselves. They had operated the most complex logistical network in history. They had faced enemy fire. They had endured impossible conditions. They had done the job. This experience, this quiet, ironclad proof of their own competence and courage, could not be erased. These veterans became the backbone of the civil rights movement. They were men who had seen the world, who had been treated as equals, or at least as essential, by liberated French and Belgian civilians. They were men who knew with absolute certainty that the lie of segregation was just that, a lie. The Red Ball Express didn't just deliver fuel to Patton's tanks. It delivered a generation of hardened, disciplined, and proven leaders back to America, ready for a new fight on their home soil. So when you see an old black and white photograph of a simple olive drab truck, remember what it truly represents. It is a monument to an idea. The idea that victory doesn't always go to the most sophisticated, but to the most determined. It is a symbol of industrial might, a 5-ton chunk of American steel that simply refused to quit. And it is a testament to the forgotten drivers, the men who fought 2 wars at once, one against fascism in Europe and another against racism at home. They kept rolling, and in doing so, they moved the entire world forward.